Welcome everybody to this online seminar with CPD College on the subject of Assessment for Learning. My name is Timmy and I'll be presenting today's seminar. The title of this seminar is Assessment for Learning in the Primary School Classroom, a Professional Obligation. This is a new seminar format which allows us to deliver very focused seminars online on specialised topics directly to you in your school. In addition, the seminar can be replayed and reviewed over the next couple of weeks at your convenience by logging into the seminar online and using your school's unique username and password. Today's seminar will consist of the presentation of information items, the viewing of practical examples of teachers using assessment for learning in the classroom, along with pauses at intervals in the presentation to allow you to complete some tasks. You may also pause the presentation at any moment if you, as a staff, wish to discuss, to assess and to reflect on any of the presented ideas and strategies. At this moment, each of you should have the printed handout as given to you by your seminar leader and a pen for note-making and brainstorming. By the end of the seminar, I hope to have clarified your understanding of this crucial topic and equipped you with some strategies for beginning your own personal journey in better using assessment for learning in your daily lessons, in your classroom, with your pupils. I hope that tomorrow, yes tomorrow, each of you will begin to, little by little, better implement assessment for learning strategies with your pupils as you work through your own lessons. So, to the subject of today's seminar. The aim of the seminar could be summarised in the following single objective: that teachers will know how to plan and deliver a lesson based on 3 of the fundamental assessment for learning principles. At the outset of our journey into this whole area of AFL, I want you to quickly take a snapshot of your own understanding of assessment and reflect on your current assessment practice. So, to our first stop and think task. I want everybody to take handout 1, task 1, and complete it, pondering the following. Assessment is. Assessment of learning is. Example, assessment for learning is. Example, and then in your own time complete the section. Reflections on current assessment practice, which provides a further snapshot of current practice in your classroom. At the end of the seminar, you can come back to your answers to see if your level of understanding has changed or remained the same, or if there's anything you would add in light of today's seminar. You have 3 minutes to complete this task. Clock starts now. Let's continue. The NCCA's book, Assessment in the Primary School Curriculum, Guidelines for Schools, states, assessment is an ongoing process of gathering, recording, interpreting, using and reporting information about a child's progress and achievement in developing knowledge, skills and attitudes. Assessment, therefore, helps the teacher to build a comprehensive picture of every child's strengths and challenges in their learning and development across the curriculum. Typical assessments might include the weekly spelling test, the end of unit maths test, the end of year Sigma and Micro T tests. These tests probably constitute your main assessment of learning activities. They're usually corrected away from the children and results are reported as grades or scores. Collectively, this basket of assessments would fall under the label Assessment of Learning. The results of assessment should help us further support and enhance learning and improve the rate at which pupils progress. However, our aim as teachers should be to develop further our skills in assessment of pupils, especially in the other area which is referred to as AFL, which is the focus of today's seminar. So, what is the meaning of this more specific term, assessment for learning? Well, according to the Assessment Reform Group in the UK, assessment for learning is the process of seeking and interpreting evidence for use by learners and their teachers to decide where the learners are in their learning, where they need to go, and how best to get there. Assessment for learning should be at the heart of personalised teaching and learning in the classroom, i.e., a teaching approach which is personalised down to the level of the individual, taking specific cognizance of each child's individual needs and seeking to meet those needs insofar as is possible in a large class of 30 pupils. If personalised learning is to be a real goal, where every child's an individual, where every child's educational needs are understood and catered for in the classroom, then this goal of real personalised learning has to be based on a strong assessment for learning strategy that is alive and at work in the classroom. We know what a difference it makes to pupils learning on a daily basis when they and their teachers have a really good understanding of three essential components of assessment for learning. Knowing, 1, where pupils are in their learning, 2, where they need to go next, and 3, how best to get there. This is what assessment for learning is all about. Establishing where they're at in their level of knowledge, understanding and skill. Mapping where we need to go next and putting in place the next steps necessary to get there. And during and at the end of the process, giving effective feedback to the learner. By investing energy and resources in assessment, schools can ensure that learning is meaningful for all pupils, teaching is effective, and attainment outcomes are improved. These should be guiding beacons for our teaching and learning interactions. Let's listen to teachers reflect on their traditional perspective on assessment and how their views have changed with the advent of assessment for learning.
Last year, if you'd asked me what I thought of when I saw the word assessment, I would have probably listed off examples of assessment that I traditionally did with the class, such as the weekly spelling test, table tests, end of unit maths tests, and the end of year standardised tests such as the Sigma and Micro T tests. These would have formed and constituted my idea of assessment. These standardised tests still have an important part to play, but now, having been upskilled in the techniques of assessment for learning, most of my lessons have assessment built into them, so I'm continuously assessing on a day-to-day basis, and it's far more effective and far easier than I could ever have imagined. Not only that, but more importantly, the children are assessing themselves continuously. In my lesson planning and delivery, I now follow the 5-point AFL lesson structure, and I find it very effective in my teaching.
My idea of assessment was formed by the revised curriculum and focused mainly on my own teacher-designed tests and tasks and evaluation of work samples in their portfolios of work, along of course with the standardised assessments towards the end of the school year. Now that was before I was introduced to the idea of assessment for learning, and before it was what I would call demystified and made clear. I still do the previous assessments, but there are lessons every week now and that have a really strong assessment for learning structure. And I have to say it has transformed teaching and learning in my class.
Yeah, I would have had a traditional notion of assessment originally. Doing the usual stuff, end of chapter tests, maths tests, spot checks, checklists, standardised tests, all that kind of stuff. Of course, they were designed by me, administered by me, corrected away from the pupils, and reported back to them then as scores and grades. And I suppose you could say, over time they were almost victims of testing, but all that's changed now with assessment for learning. Assessment happens every day in my classroom now with my pupils. It's ongoing, it's within the natural rhythm of the lessons. Assessment is now part of the teaching and learning as opposed to the more traditional idea of end of the week, end of term or end of year assessment. Children are now very much part of the process. In fact, you could nearly say they're in charge of the process, and that's the major difference, and it does make a difference.
As we see from the teachers in that clip, their views of assessment have changed a lot since getting involved in the Assessment for Learning Schools network under the auspices of the NCCA, and they now see assessment as a tool to be used on a daily basis to help them adjust learning as they are working along through the lesson. They're committed practitioners of assessment for learning strategies. So let's firstly distinguish between and be clear on the differences between AOL and AFL. Assessment of learning. Test, correct, score, record, report. In the instance where the teacher records the child's progress and achievements in learning and reports the information to the pupils themselves or to the parents or even other people such as the special education needs teacher, the principal and the school psychologist, etc. This approach to assessment is called assessment of learning. The teacher usually shares the assessment in the form of grades and scores, be that with the children or other parties. The grades and scores are useful when making comparisons about the child's progress and achievements over a defined period. They also allow children to be ranked according to learning progression. The awarding of grades and scores usually happens at the end of a piece of learning or at a specific time in the school year. For example, the end of year tests, the standardised tests or a maths test on length when the Strand unit is complete. Again, this is called AOL. While assessment of learning is valid and will always have an important role in education, it does have its limitations. We might say that the assessment is done to the children rather than with them. That is a very important difference and should be reiterated. Assessment of learning is done to the children, while assessment for learning is done with them. So, what's the other way, beyond recording and reporting, that the information on assessment can be used? Another way, assessment for learning, the teacher and the children can use the assessment information on an ongoing, minute-by-minute, day-by-day basis to clearly identify the next steps needed to improve the learning. This approach to assessment is called assessment for learning. So instead of grades or marks being given, the teacher uses the child's piece of work to give clear feedback on the learning. The teacher's feedback to the child focuses on three main things. What worked well? What gaps still remain? More importantly, how the child can improve on their work. So what does assessment for learning look like? Or better still, an AFL lesson look like in the classroom? Always think of AFL within the context of a lesson, and I assure you it will be much clearer and more meaningful. Here's a lesson outline, and I will deal with the three key principles as we proceed. It's a senior infants lesson based on writing. In this lesson on the board, we see the three key principles exemplified. These principles should underpin and govern the format of many lessons in an embedded AFL approach. The key principles are 1. Sharing the learning intention with the children in the form of a WALT, an acronym that stands for We Are Learning Too. In this lesson, there's just one. We are learning to write sentences. 2. Sharing the criteria for success with the children in the form of a WILF, a further acronym that stands for What I'm Looking For. In this lesson, there are 3. What I'm looking for is a capital letter at the start of each sentence. What I'm looking for is a full stop at the end of each sentence. What I'm looking for is proper spaces between words. 3. Giving effective feedback to the children during and at the end of the work. In this lesson, I would be circulating around the room, encouraging effort, complimenting evidence if the WILFs are achieved, and highlighting any missing capital letters, full stops of poor or inconsistent or missing spaces. Taken together, these assessment for learning principles are about helping the children to become very aware of 3 things. What it is they're learning. WALT, to write sentences. How they will know that they've been successful. WILF, capitals, full stops and spaces. 3. What steps they have to take to improve on their progress. Feedback. How much better our lessons would be if they were solidly built around these 3 key principles. So let's look at some classroom video of another lesson which is planned along the lines of very strong AFL principles. It's an English writing lesson with a 3rd class. It's the best way to appreciate how the lesson incorporates strong AFL features. Note how clear Anne and the pupils are on the WALT or learning intention, on the WILF or success criteria. Also note how Anne provides feedback to the pupils, which confirms present strengths and charts a future trait to work on. Watch out and note these 3 factors: the WALT, the WILF and feedback. We will analyse the main features of the lesson when we come back. So, over to Anne in the classroom.
Hi, my name is Anne and I teach a 3rd class in a rural school. The following lesson illustrates a typical assessment for learning lesson approach to an English writing lesson that I did with my class. I wanted them to write a story for me using 3 paragraphs with a suitable title and to make good use of a word bank. As a stimulus and focus for the writing, I read the children the story Jamaica's Find by Juanita Haville, but did not tell them the title that Juanita had put on her story. Afterwards, we discussed the story genre, focusing them on the structure, that is, nice paragraphs, on the nice descriptive words, and finally we brainstormed possible titles and we got lots of suggestions. I told them that we were going to write our own stories. We would write our own stories about finding something and illustrate them with a single strong image. We devised, agreed and shared our learning intention for the lesson and wrote it up on the board. WALT, we are learning to write a story using paragraphs. I next outlined the task. The children were tasked with writing a story about something they found in a place and what they did afterwards. In preparation for this writing lesson, we identified suitable vocabulary to create a word bank. The children would now use the word bank as a support in writing a story in paragraphs. I wanted words to do with weather, location description, tell us something of the person, describe how you felt, and use some of the following words: surprisingly, reported, excited, next, eventually, finally, to help move the story along. We looked at story outlines and agreed the following: beginning, where were you? Describe. Middle, what did you find? Where did you find it? What did you do? How did you feel? End, what happened in the end? I then explicitly explained what I was looking for in a good story. In other words, the success criteria. To do this, I got the children to look again at the story Jamaica's Find. Through questioning and discussion, I helped the children to use this extract to identify and come up with our success criteria. That is, what it is I'm looking for that shows the task has been done well and done fully. We agreed on the following success criteria and expressed them as WILFs, which I wrote up on the whiteboard. What I'm looking for is a suitable title. What I'm looking for are 3 well-planned paragraphs. What I'm looking for is good use of the word bank. Notice how we included the words suitable, well-planned and good in the success criteria. These words are important as they help the children to see what I'm looking for, and that is something more than simply a title, 3 paragraphs and evidence that they have used words from the word bank. Many of the children can write a story with a title, 3 paragraphs and words from the word bank. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that they have written to the standard that I'm looking for. We framed the success criteria so that we explicitly knew what a very good standard of a story would look like. They understood that they needed a title that captures the essence of the story, paragraphs that were well thought out with ideas that developed on from one another, and suitable use of descriptive words from the word bank. So, as they begin the task, the children have a very clear roadmap for what they are learning, the WALT. We are learning to write a story using paragraphs, and they are very clear on what the teacher is looking for as evidence of success. That is, the 3 WILFs. What I'm looking for is a suitable title on your story, 3 well-planned paragraphs, and good use of your word bank. Here is a sample of the work from one of the girls in our class, Aisling. In my opinion, this was a very good standard of work. Aisling did quite well in relation to the 3 success criteria.
Berry picking. It was midsummer and the sun was high in the sky. Lucy and Anna, her sister, were picking juicy ripe berries on White Mountain. Surprisingly, there was a lot of berries left. Lucky for us, those pesky birds mustn't have found them yet, said Anna. As the 2 girls were walking along by the hedgerow, Lucy saw a small hut in the distance. Lucy and Anna felt the excitement inside them rising. Anna was also wondering should they be so far from home. Eventually, Lucy persuaded her older sister to go explore the hut. 20 minutes later, they were standing on the doorstep, scratched from climbing over the ditches and walls, next wondering what was on the other side. Anna turned the handle, and to their amazement, there was nothing inside, except for a few implements used by the turf cutters. All that fear for nothing. Let's get home, said Lucy.
In my opinion, this was a very good standard of work. Aisling did quite well in relation to the 3 success criteria. The following is the feedback I shared verbally with her. Aisling, your story was very good and I really enjoyed reading it. I especially liked the title you chose, Berry Picking. My favourite sentence was, "Luckily for us, those pesky birds mustn't have found them yet," said Anna. You made some use of the words in the word bank, however, you only showed 2 paragraphs. Next time, please make sure to use more paragraphs and to clearly show your paragraph breaks. Also, next time, please pay greater attention to your word bank. Overall, though, this was a very good piece of work. Well done, Aisling.
Welcome back. Wasn't that an excellent lesson by Anne? Its strength is derived mostly from the strong AFL principles that underpin it. Firstly, for AFL to work, you must at the outset of your lesson be very clear on the learning intentions and share them with the pupils so that they too are very clear on what it is they're supposed to be learning. We use a lovely soft accessible term called WALT, which is the acronym for We Are Learning Too, and is really a statement of the lesson objective, but way softer and, for me, much more clearer and easier for the pupils to understand. We are learning to write a story using paragraphs. Secondly, they must be clear on what the teacher is looking for that demonstrates that he or she has been successful and reached the desired level of satisfactory work and achieved the learning intention or WALT. This is expressed as a WILF, what I'm looking for. It makes clear for the pupils what the teacher is specifically looking for, the things that will indicate success. What I'm looking for, in this case, Anne was looking for each child to choose a suitable title for your story. Write 3 well-planned paragraphs. Make good use of our word bank. Thirdly, the pupils need feedback from the teacher that confirms the successes and highlights the necessary improvements and next steps for future progress. See how Anne confined feedback to the success criteria or WILFs. These 3 steps are at the heart of good AFL and, by implication, great teaching and learning. My mantra when it comes to lesson planning and delivery is give them the WALT, give them the WILF, and give them the feedback. So Anne's lesson, in summary, was very effective, with an explicit learning intention shared with the pupils and 3 explicit success criteria that the pupils could aim for, and we would know if they were achieved. Anne was also feeding back comments based on these success criteria for this lesson. Both teacher and students were very clear on all three elements: the WALT, the WILF and the feedback. So our new acronym is WALT, meaning we are learning to, and it is used at the outset of lessons to share the learning intention. From here on, you should be using WALT at the outset of most lessons to make the learning intention explicit and clear for the students. For AFL to take place, it's vital that pupils have a clear understanding of the learning intentions for each lesson. It's not enough to say, today we are going to do some writing. Much better would be a more specific and focused WALT, such as: we are learning to identify descriptive words and phrases in our reading lesson that we can use when making descriptions. Pupils now know that descriptive words and phrases are the focus of this reading lesson. Learning intentions need to be focused and specific. Therefore, a definition of learning intention might be: a learning intention is what teachers hope pupils will know, understand or be able to do by the end of the lesson or set of lessons. The learning intentions enable the pupils to know the purpose of the activity or task they are being asked to partake in. I would say that they are much more likely to achieve the purpose if they know what it is in the first place they are supposed to be learning. As a result, when you clearly state the learning intention, the responsibility for learning is transferred from the teacher to the pupil. It focuses the pupil on the task and encourages both self-assessment and peer assessment within the journey that is the lesson. The teacher can share the learning intention, or WALT, in various ways with the children at the outset of the lesson, such as writing a clear statement on the whiteboard in language that the children can understand. Example: we are learning to write our letters clearly, work effectively in groups. We are learning to use evidence to draw conclusions. We are learning to identify odd and even numbers. We are learning to describe an interesting character in our story. In the following video footage, we meet Seamus. Seamus is a 5th and 6th class teacher of 32 boys and girls. His class is in a DEIS school, meaning delivering equality in school. This footage shows how Seamus used an assessment for learning, or an AFL approach, for the children's learning. It relates to a geography project that he did with the class over the course of 2 weeks. He follows a classic AFL lesson 5-point plan approach. Number 1, we are learning to create the lesson intention, WALT. 2, task outline, sharing the learning task. 3, what I'm looking for, create and share the success criteria with the pupils. 4, task completion. Children work at the task either individually, in pairs or in groups. 5, feedback. Teacher gives feedback on the task to the children. The main reason for watching this lesson in such detail is because this lesson format could be any teacher in any school, in any class, delivering any lesson. The lesson structure remains the same. The details can change. The video will take us through each of the 5 steps in turn so that we can appreciate and assimilate the process. Step 1. OK, let's watch as Seamus creates the learning intention, or WALT, with the class. Notice how he arrives at the learning intention through active questioning. So let's watch Seamus creating his learning intention, or WALT.
My name is Seamus and I will be focusing on a project we did on France. I will take you through each of the 5 steps of the assessment for learning lesson that we used in this project. Step 1. So how do we create the learning intention, or WALT, with the class? I like to arrive at the learning intention through active questioning. In geography, we had been talking about other peoples in other lands, and over a 2-week period we decided to look at France. So the children were asked to think about France and to identify things that we could learn about that country. Through questioning and probing, the children came up with various aspects of France that interested them, such as history, language, customs, culture, food, geography, famous people, landmarks, etc. We translated all of this into a strong learning intention, or WALT. We are learning to, which I wrote up onto the whiteboard. WALT. We are learning to become aware of life in France. Obviously, the next question was, how will we become aware of life in France? Pupils suggested we could find out all about France through internet research, looking at reference books, bringing in pupil artefacts from trips they made to France, and listening to some first-hand recounts from children who had been there in the past. Next, I asked them how we might show people our research and findings on France and share that information. We came up with a second WALT. WALT. We are learning to share our findings with others around us. Through questioning, the pupils agreed that their research would be compiled into and presented in a scrapbook on this occasion, and that oral presentations will be made to the class at the end of the project. To check if children understand what we are doing, I sometimes use traffic lights symbols, where children hold up one of 3 coloured circular discs to indicate understanding of what we are doing. My question to them was, does everybody understand what we are setting out to do in this lesson? Children hold up a traffic light which tells me, green, I really understand, orange, a little unsure and I have a question, red, unsure, I have questions. I would always ask a couple of the children holding up a green to give me their understanding, which clarifies it for others also. Mark, one of the boys in the class, summarised it as follows.
We will be learning all about life in France, finding out and writing the facts and information into a scrapbook with pictures and drawings and making a presentation at the end to the class.
Welcome back. Step 2. After arriving at the learning intention of the lesson, Seamus next carries out a brainstorming exercise on the topic, establishing the ingredients of the lesson subject and the parameters of the learning, what points the children might include in the project, and the scope and sequence of the project within which the learning will take place.
After creating, agreeing and sharing the WALT or the learning intention for the lesson, I next carry out a brainstorming exercise with the children to record their ideas and suggestions on the scope and parameters of the task. In this case, what aspects of France we might study and what we might need to complete that task. In our brainstorm, which I recorded onto a second dry whiteboard, they suggested famous people, buildings and sites, sport and pastimes, lifestyles, maps and pictures, interesting facts, findings, similarities and differences between France and Ireland, and that we would use maps and pictures. This constituted the detail of the task they were going to engage with for the learning project. There were a lot of things they were going to look at in the task. We agreed that we would work collaboratively in pairs on this task, and we wrote the learning task up as follows. We are going to research the lives of people living in France. The information must be relevant.
Welcome back once again. Step 3. Next, Seamus wants a way of knowing if the task has been done and done well. Indeed, the pupils will also want to know the yardstick by which Seamus will judge their work. In other words, what will be the criteria of success? What will he be looking for? This is the WILF, what I'm looking for. The class discuss and agree on the success criteria. Together, they arrive at the success criteria. Introducing success criteria to pupils is important because they improve pupils' understanding. They empower pupils and allow them to take ownership over their own learning. They encourage independent learning by acting as a checklist from which the pupil can self-assess their work. They enable accurate feedback. What are the success criteria for Seamus's geography lesson? Let's watch and see what he and his pupils come up with.
At this point in the lesson introduction, the children know what the learning intention is, the WALT we are learning to, and what comprises the learning task. Next, we need to know the success criteria. That is, how will we know if it has been a good task? Another way of saying success criteria is, well, what I'm looking for. So what am I looking for as evidence of a good project? What are my success criteria? What's the evidence for a task well done? During an engaging discussion, the class volunteered the following. What I'm looking for is making good use of pictures and maps. WILF, what I'm looking for is facts and information relevant to what we discussed. What I'm looking for is how well we work in pairs. What I'm looking for, using different sources in our project to gather the information. WILF, what I'm looking for, good oral presentation of the information. That means good body language and good voice projection. I wrote the success criteria or WILFs onto the whiteboard as shown. We then created a rubric together. The rubric allowed our pupils to judge the quality of their finished work according to the level of success achieved on each of the success criteria, from high success to moderate success to low success. The rubric was created together on the whiteboard and was as shown. Because some of the task was being done at home, I put the lesson outline on one side of an A4 sheet and the rubric on the reverse, and each pupil got a copy in a pouch pocket into their school bag. It is essential that they have the WALT and WILF to reference at all times during the project to gauge progress and success. With a structured lesson plan in place, learning intention clear, the success criteria agreed and explicit, I expected some very good work as the pupils began their project on France.
To continue, Step 4. In Step 4, children begin to work at the task. They're clear on the learning intention WALT and they have been given the success criteria or WILF, i.e. what I'm looking for, or what the teacher is looking for, as evidence that the task has been done well and done fully. They know how much time they have for the task so that they can pace themselves. Thus, the pupils are focused, know what is required and stay on task. Let's have a look in on the work in the classroom as it progresses.
With a strong, clear plan in place, the children dug in with gusto. They worked in pairs, hitting the internet and Google for facts and information. The encyclopedias in both book and CD format were used. The atlases were consulted. Books from the library relevant to France were assembled on a table. And over the course of the first week, pupils brought in further material from home. Postcards, wine bottles, berets, song CDs, flags, French train, plane and bus tickets, menus, event access tickets, etc. All of which were handled and scrutinised by all for information. Maps were drawn and coloured. Facts were collected and presented. Pictures were drawn or cut. Over the course of the 2 weeks, between classroom work and work at home, the project soon took shape and moved through the phases of research and note-making and gathering, through writing, drawing, colouring and cutting, into the design, layout and assembly phase, where the children began to derive a real pride in the emerging product.
And finally, Step 5. The final step in the learning is feedback from the teacher or your peers on the finished piece of work or project. This could be in the form of a quick oral conference on a one-to-one basis with the teacher, or the feedback could use the form of a rubric where pupils compare their own or others' work according to a given set of criteria, as you will see in the video clip. The rubric allows pupils to self-assess or peer-assess according to the level of achievement on each of the WILFs, or success criteria.
It is very important to remind the children to reference their rubric as the project progresses, to be sure they are covering all the criteria and to as high a standard as possible. In this way, they are tracking their own progress, that is, self-assessing and peer-assessing their partners or other groups. I also circulate through the room, asking them to comment on their own progress, and I would also comment and ask a focus question. Example, making good use of maps and pictures is one of the success criteria in your rubric. How do you think you're doing? My comments, feedback and questioning revolves around the WILFs or success criteria as agreed at the outset. The assessment is ongoing, happening in real time and is happening with the children and is therefore so much more beneficial. Besides presenting their findings on life in France in their scrapbooks, which were excellent overall, I called on 4 different parents to come to the top of the classroom and make an oral presentation of their findings to their peers. One pairing dressed as French bakers for the presentation and went into role, which was very entertaining. Another pair wore red, white and blue, the French colours, and made a presentation. 2 out of the 4 groups remembered that they were being assessed on body movement and voice projection. Again, a specific criteria as originally agreed at the outset. This was pointed out to all in the feedback at the end of the presentations. Finally, the children coloured in their rubrics either green, orange or red according to how they perceived their level of success on each of the criteria.
My final point regarding Seamus's lesson. Remember, this lesson illustrates the common 5-point lesson structure that pertains to any good AFL guided work. Challenge. Your challenge is that in the coming days you plan and deliver lessons in the mould of this geography lesson we've just watched. Plan and deliver lessons using this common lesson structure and experience the learning dynamic that is an assessment for learning approach. The lesson structure is one of the handouts. Okay, well the learning intentions, WALTs and success criteria WILFs need to be displayed for all to see during the lesson. For me, I keep a 6x4 board free for this very task. I write up the 5-point plan with them. They're part of the process. It remains on the board for the duration of the lesson, so I find my dedicated dry whiteboard excellent. If it's a project type activity that will stretch over 2 or 3 weeks, then I prefer to record and display the WALTs and WILFs on the interactive whiteboard so that I can pull them up again in a couple of days or next week whenever we return to the ongoing task. I know other teachers like to write them on the blackboard, maybe on a flip chart. Some teachers find this more appropriate than the blackboard, as they might want to use the blackboard during the lesson. Perhaps onto chart paper and display it around the classroom. It's often very useful, as you might want to refer to the learning intentions again in subsequent lessons. Copybooks can be used, or individual whiteboards, or laminated pages that can be rubbed clean after each use. And also you might want to write them onto small cards and give them to groups to be read and discussed. By the way, now that I think of it, there are some tips that should be borne in mind for sharing learning intentions with pupils. 1. Start small and don't include too many. 2. Separate the learning intention from the activity or context. 3. Tell pupils why they're learning by relating their learning to the big picture. 4. Use child-friendly language. 5. Make them visible. That leads me to a question of my own. If these learning intentions are so important, and if they're basically the reason underpinning every lesson, then we need to look at how we express and write the learning intention. What is the language of learning intentions? The curriculum documents are a vital starting point when drawing up your learning intentions. The strand units of the curriculum are full of objectives, or as I prefer to think of them, as learning intentions. Learning intentions need to be expressed in clear, child-friendly language. This can raise a number of problems, because we often assume that if something is clear to us, then it must be clear to everyone else. It's not enough to simply take an objective from the curriculum and deliver it to pupils as a learning intention. For example, if we take one of the English curriculum objectives for first and second classes, the child should be enabled to develop comprehension strategies. It's obviously not expressed in child-friendly language because it's a document for teachers. The teacher could express it as a learning intention by reshaping the objective as follows. Example, we are learning to create a movie in our mind while reading, visualizing, or we're learning to use clues in the story to find out what it really means, making inferences. So, although the curriculum documents are a vital starting point in determining what the pupils need to learn at their specific developmental stage, those objectives must be adapted and reshaped in order to create learning intentions that we can share with pupils. Keep the WALT and learning intention clear and accessible to the pupils. We also need to bear in mind those pupils with special educational needs and pupils with English as an additional language when devising learning intentions. This will ensure that learning intentions are delivered in language accessible to every pupil. Well-expressed learning intentions should contain words associated with learning. So, where might we look for a repository of words associated with learning? We need look no further than the work of Benjamin Bloom, who in 1956 presented a classification of learning objectives. Bloom's taxonomy can be a useful tool when planning learning intentions, as it incorporates words or active verbs that are associated with learning. Bloom's taxonomy words or phrases include the following domains and active verbs: knowledge, remember and recall information. Words such as draw, know, name, select, record, identify, describe, explain. Example, name the counties in Leinster. Comprehension, understanding the information. Words like sort, decide, distinguish, summarise, discuss, select, present, explain why. Example, summarise what we've learned about the main character in Chapter 3. Application, applying the information or new knowledge. Words like classify, apply, discover, prepare, demonstrate, calculate, and solve. Example, sort the animals according to whether they're carnivores or herbivores or omnivores. Analysis, analysing the information that's before you. Words like conclude, analyse, interpret, distinguish, select. Example, analyse the data we gathered and represented on our block graph and write some statements of fact. Synthesis, evaluating the information. Design, formulate, plan, predict, combine, create, rewrite, explain the difference between. Example, design and carry out your own survey and draw a set of conclusions. Evaluation, creating a new perception or skill. Words like assess, compare, contrast, critique, interpret, make connections between, evaluate. Example, can you carry out a survey any way you like? I like to keep a comprehensive list of Bloom's words in my weekly planning folder for ready reference and use these active learning verbs when writing and expressing our learning intentions for the lesson. Remember, it's a hierarchy of learning. Be sure to draw active verbs and learning intentions from the upper area of the pyramid, from the cognitive domains of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So, to be clear, use the vocabulary of Bloom's taxonomy when writing the waltz or learning intentions, and having decided on the learning intention and having expressed it clearly, be sure to display and share it with the pupils. Right, time for a task. Look at the following lesson outline. This lesson is with a 5th class, and the children are going to practice writing an instructional text type. I want you to write the narrative of and supply the missing parts. In this lesson, we're learning to write a set of instructions. What would you talk about? What task will you set? What will your Wilf's or success criteria be? Try to get 5. What will your feedback focus on? You have 3 minutes to complete it.
Please go to Stop and Think Task 2 in your handout to complete the task.
Welcome back. The WALT was to write instructions. We might have talked about the distinguishing features of this text type through viewing a collection of instructional texts. The task might have been to write a set of directions on how to get to the swimming pool. What I'm looking for might have been a title or heading. What I'm looking for, numbered lists. What I'm looking for might have been diagrams or maps. What I'm looking for, maybe most sentences begin with a verb. Feedback. I'll be looking for evidence of the 4 criteria being included and accuracy. At this stage of proceedings, you should have a very good grasp of the common lesson structure that governs an AFL-focused lesson. So, what is the impact of learning intentions and success criteria on pupils? They become more focused on the learning process. They have clearer expectations. They show more concentration, take more ownership of their learning. They check their own and each other's work against success criteria. They work more quickly, become more motivated. They become more articulate. They no longer ask the teacher for task instructions, and the pupils become more independent. So, what is the impact of learning intentions and success criteria on teachers? They devise more focused lessons. They have a positive effect on planning. They become more concerned about learning processes than covering the curriculum. So far, we've looked in particular detail at 2 of the key principles of assessment for learning: sharing the learning intention, or WALT, and sharing the criteria for success, or WILF. Giving clear feedback to the learner is another critical part of the assessment for learning progress. Using the child's completed sample of work, the teacher provides clear feedback on the learning progress made. This feedback will focus on 3 things. What went well? What gaps still exist? And crucially, 3, what next steps the child and teacher might now take to close that gap? Feedback is the 3rd pillar at the heart of AFL. Referring back to our earlier 4th class writing lesson, this feedback is not just concerned with the spelling, grammar and the overall neatness of the work. The feedback is based on the learning intention, or WALT, and more particularly the criteria for success, or WILF, shared at the start of the lesson. The best way to appreciate this 3rd and important principle is to view some classroom examples of feedback in action. So, assessment for learning is about using assessment information to inform the next steps to improve the child's learning and the teacher's teaching. Okay, let's watch the feedback in action.
Hi, my name is Pauline, and in the following lesson I set out to do a piece of writing with my 1st class group. I'll now share the lesson with you. The lesson integrated geography and English in the process. The subject was geography and the strand was environmental care and awareness. The strand unit was caring for my locality, and the content objective was to record and communicate experiences and observations with others using oral language and pictures. The other subject that I integrated was English, the strand was writing, and the strand unit was competence and confidence in using language. And the content objectives were write and draw frequently and write for different audiences. The lesson's learning intention, or WALT, which stands for We Are Learning To, was we are learning to share our experiences with others. I verbally shared the WALT with the class and wrote it on the whiteboard. And this lesson was taught near the end of the 1st term in 1st class. And the children's ability to express themselves both verbally and in writing is continually improving. As part of the task, I took the class out into the school grounds, and they were to use their 5 senses as they engaged with nature all around them. Following our return to the classroom, we talked about our experience, what we saw, what we heard, touched, felt and thought, and all those things. And during the talk, we created a word bank as follows: sun, wind, nest, touched, yard, nature, etc. I asked lots of questions to help tease out the children's thinking as we arrived at our success criteria, or what I'm looking for, WILF. The WILFs were to draw what you saw in clear detail and in colour, write some interesting sentences using the word bank, and share your experience well with the class. Because the children are only in 1st class, I displayed the WILFs in pictures and words on the whiteboard. I also reminded them of the WILFs throughout the lesson. Before the children began this task, I helped them to use the 3 WILFs to create a rubric. We don't use a rubric all the time, but it's useful sometimes to help make the WILFs clearer for the children. We call the rubric our faces: the green smiley face, the orange OK face, and the red sad face. This rubric is based on the 3 WILFs which are set out on the left of the page. The rubric helps the children to see that there were different levels of quality across each of the WILFs. For example, while the children knew that I was looking for them to write sentences using the word bank, the rubric helped them to see that their sentences would be categorised at a certain level, depending on how well they used the word bank. The rubric made the child consider how well he or she did in using the word bank to write interesting sentences. I should point out that this level of preparation does take a lot of time, especially when you first start to use the approach, but it really is worthwhile as the children gradually learn to become more independent and focused as they complete their tasks while checking their success criteria. The amount of time you need for planning becomes less as you and the children get more experienced in using the AFL approach. I find AFL becomes a way of thinking for us in our class rather than an end in itself. Over time and with experience, you will become adept at creating rubrics fast. They're not always required and suit some tasks more than others. I should also point out that not every lesson has to be planned like this. You may find that for some subjects, it's not feasible to achieve the learning intention in one lesson. You may need different tasks to work on the same concept for a number of lessons, and in this case, you can use the same WALT, WILF and rubric. Based on the task I outlined earlier, here's a completed sample for a child named Aoife, and here's how she shared it with the class.
I saw lots of sheep in a field. I heard lots and lots of birds chirping. I felt the wind blowing in my face. I saw a bee flying over to a flower. I saw a bunch of flowers wobbling. I felt the sun shining on me. We all saw a bird in a nest. Our schoolyard is a lovely place to be.
I chose Aoife's work because it was a very good sample of work, and I gave feedback on her work with the whole class listening as an example of the standard I look for in similar pieces of work. And here's the feedback I gave Aoife. Aoife, you've written 7 great sentences about your experiences and you made good use of the words from the word bank. You read loudly and clearly to the rest of the class. Well done. I asked the children how Aoife could make her work better, and they suggested that she could name the bird or the flower. The children really liked the AFL approach to assessment, and here's what Aoife said about the lesson.
I got the green smiley face because I did a lot of sentences and I used lots of words from the word bank, and I did good writing and good drawing.
Another feedback approach that I use is the 2 stars and a wish feedback approach. This feedback approach aims to encourage the children to reflect on their own and each other's learning. Teachers can use the 2 stars and a wish approach in giving feedback to the children, that is, 2 identified successes and 1 area of improvement needed for the learning. This approach is very useful for teachers but can also be used by pupils themselves in assessing each other's work, helping them to be less reliant on adult support for feedback and to become more independent in their own learning. Based on groups researching similarities and differences between different cultures, feedback might run as follows. My first star is that you worked very well together as a group. I was watching your group and you all got straight in and knuckled down and got on with the work. There was discussion about the task, and that's important. My second star is that I did see you looking at the WILFs to make sure you were doing what you were asked. Well done. My wish is that the next time you might just work a little bit faster and get the task finished within the time allowed. You need to give some time to discussion, but also time to complete the task. Use the AFL poster reinforcing the 2 stars and a wish method of improvement and assessment. This poster looks good. It'll brighten up your classroom and carry a positive message as well.
Welcome back. Let's take some of the important points from that lesson and from the literature on feedback to summarise the key aspects. We know that as part of the learning process, we need to give the pupils feedback on their work. The pupils use this feedback to improve their future work, to ensure that the next work they do embraces what they've learned. Feedback also affects how pupils feel about their work, and inevitably also about themselves. Feedback thus also affects student motivation. Feedback remains essential to the learning equation. Students quite possibly treasure your oral feedback. Giving good feedback is a skill which can be learned and honed. In giving feedback, react positively to the good things in students' work. Make helpful suggestions on ways in which their work could have been improved. Correct misapprehensions revealed in their work. Make suggestions for how they can change their approach in the future. Do this in a way which respects the individuality and worth of each student. Do this in a way which makes good and efficient use of your time. You need to be quick and economical with your feedback. First, give them the good news. They need to know what they've done right or well. They need to know this so that they'll keep on doing it right or well, and also because it will make them feel appropriately good about themselves and their work, which in itself aids learning as well as feeling good. Good news needs to be clear. If you think it was great, or excellent, or admirable, or very stimulating, then say so. Have the courage of your convictions. Specific. Words like great or excellent carry a strong emotional message. Say exactly what was good and why it was good. Personal. That is, make the person you're giving feedback to feel acknowledged as an individual. Using their name in the feedback helps. Emma, I thought the way you handled that was very original. I particularly like the way you... Next, give them bad news, constructively, and tell them why it's bad and what to do about it. They also need to know what they've done wrong, or poorly, or performed in some other way which is inappropriate within the subject. And immediately and always, they need to know in what respect it was wrong, or poor, or inappropriate. And they need suggestions on ways in which it could have been correct or better. This is where real learning happens. In primarily numerical or scientific disciplines, where at least some of the answers to some of the questions can be right or wrong, reasons for giving prompt and reasoned feedback on wrong answers include: so that the learner won't repeat the specific error, so that they can identify the misunderstanding which led to the error, so that they can develop a new and correct understanding. In disciplines where answers are more likely to be considered good or bad, rather than primarily right or wrong, reasons for giving this kind of feedback on poor answers include: to help them appropriate why their approach or answer was inappropriate, to help the learner see the preferred approach. Bad news needs to be specific. Make it clear to what you are reacting. Which word, which idea, which equation, which stylistic feature. Make it clear in what respects the work is wrong, inappropriate, whatever it is. Constructive. Suggest how the work could have been made accurate, good, conforming to the paradigm of the subject, whatever. Suggest sources of information and guidance. Give them a handle, encouragement, whatever seems right. Kind. Specific is kind. Constructive is kind. Poor, scribbled at the bottom, is cruel. Honest. Say what's required while being specific, constructive, and kind. Students often greatly value useful feedback on their work. Feedback is individual attention, an individual response. Your carefully considered comments on their work, picking out the positives to start, your suggestion on how they could have tackled the work differently, or your suggestions for a particular piece of further reading which casts important new light on the topic, all these will be very well received. The trouble is, you probably don't have an hour or more to spend giving feedback to each student on their work. How can you make sure the students get quality feedback on their work without you staying up all night providing it? There are several ways. Give feedback in terms of explicit criteria. In short, the idea is to say in advance what will be the characteristics of a good piece of work for the assignment. Feedback on the WILFs or agreed success criteria. Feedback from themselves and each other. Use self and peer assessment. Example, by completing a rubric, they will be able to assess their own level of success. Only give feedback on one aspect of their work each time. Keep focused on the agreed success criteria or WILFs. There we are. I hope this discussion on feedback has given you an appreciation of its key importance in the assessment for learning process. To reiterate, feedback must focus on 3 key things. 1. what went well, 2, what gaps still exist, and 3, what next steps the teacher and child might take to close that gap.
How does an AFL lesson plan approach benefit the children's learning? The following points need to be made. Children are very clear on the scope and sequence of their lessons, and the common structure allows them to organise and conceptualise their learning around this structure. Children are clear on the learning intentions, or WALT, and can work towards achieving them in the lesson. Children know what is required of them in the learning task through the teacher explicitly sharing the success criteria in the form of a WILF. Children are empowered with an awareness of how he or she learns and is thus better able to set goals and develop a variety of learning strategies. Children develop an ability to evaluate their own learning processes. This is achieved through actively building pupil skills at peer and self-assessment, which is done through focusing on whether the clear success criteria or WILFs have been achieved. By sharing the language and strategies of AFL with the pupils, over time, pupils will become increasingly better at self and peer assessments. Teachers who are already incorporating AFL into their teaching would regard themselves as facilitators of learning rather than experts or fountains of knowledge. This is perhaps the biggest shift that teachers have to come to terms with when embracing assessment for learning. Teachers using AFL guide students toward the development of their own learning to learn skills. At the outset, we stated that assessment of learning is done to the children, while assessment for learning is done with them. Can you see the truth of this statement? AFL is done with them. So, in considering changing the roles of teachers and pupils, we see the use of assessment for learning to improve pupil learning and to help pupils become independent learners, requiring teachers and pupils to acknowledge this fundamental shift in how they perceive each other's roles in the learning process. The traditional classroom. The teacher is an active agent. In a traditional classroom setting, the teacher is perceived as the active agent in the process, determining goals and criteria for successful achievement, delivering instruction, and evaluating pupils' achievement at the end of a period of learning. Assessment for learning classroom. Teacher and pupils collaborative agents. The use of assessment for learning improves learning and helps pupils become independent learners, but requires a culture in which pupil and teacher learn together in a collaborative relationship, each playing an active role in setting learning goals, developing success criteria, giving and receiving feedback, asking questions, and adjusting learning strategies. The teacher acts as a lead learner, providing support while gradually releasing more and more responsibility to the pupil. In order to make the transition from teacher to lead learner, teachers can make use of the gradual release of responsibility model. This is an excellent model to adopt and can be summarised as follows. Behaviour. In teacher modelling, I the teacher do, you the learner watch. In guided practice, I the teacher do, you the learner help. In independent practice, you the learner do, I the teacher help. In application, you the learner do, I the teacher watch. In moving to application phase, there has been a full transfer of responsibility from teacher to pupil. What are the benchmarks for quality assessment? Good assessment for learning ensures an accurate assessment, knowing what the standards are, judging pupils' work correctly, and making accurate assessments linked to the attainment targets of the primary school curriculum. Good assessment for learning ensures a fair assessment, knowing the methods used are valid. Good assessment for learning ensures a reliable assessment, ensuring that judgments are consistent and based on a range of evidence. Good assessment for learning ensures a useful assessment, identifying barriers to pupil progress and using that information to plan and discuss the next steps in learning. Good assessment for learning ensures a focused assessment, identifying areas of a child's learning where there are blocks to progression, which might, for example, benefit from the attention of one-to-one tuition. By implementing the basic principles of assessment for learning, sharing learning intentions, WALT, sharing success criteria, WILF, and by ensuring quality questioning, peer or self-assessment and effective and constructive feedback, pupils will know where they're going at the start of the lesson journey, know they're on the right track throughout the lesson journey, and finally know where to go next once they've reached their destination. Your challenge in the coming days. In the coming days, plan for and build AFL into some of your lessons. Develop lesson plans using the 5-point common lesson structure as outlined and demonstrated on many occasions throughout this seminar. After delivering the lesson, reflect on the parts that worked well and not so well, and your ideas for moving forward and further refining your AFL lesson approach. Finally, let this seminar be the beginning of your journey and not a final destination. Let it be the planting of the seed and not the final harvest. Let it be a setting sail into new waters through further reading, research, practice, trial and error, and implementation of AFL strategies and techniques. May you grow as a teacher in your implementation of AFL in the days, months, and years ahead. It remains for me to thank you for partaking in this seminar and to wish you a safe journey home.